before I go any further, let me please introduce our speakers today. I would like to hand over first. It's probably nicer if you make your own introductions. Nick, maybe you can say a few words about you.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I'm Nick Solowski. I work with Foundations of Success, and we've been working with the network looking at different types of scaling approaches. I'm based in the United States in the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And can you hear us and can you say a few words? Okay, that doesn't seem to work with Anne, unfortunately, so to send our apologies on Anne's behalf. She's at the moment in a location with very poor internet connectivity, so she'll not be able to co-present. And with that, I would like to hand over to Gustavo to say a few words, and to Valentina.
Hi, hello, I'm Gustavo. I'm a consultant based on Brazil. I'm with Conserve Brazil. I'm a conservation coach. I'm part of the steering committee of the community of practice of Indigenous Conservation Standards Projects, and I also co-lead the Latin America regional for CCNet. It's a pleasure to be here. Valentina.
Thank you, Gustavo. I'm Valentina. I'm from Colombia. We are like leading with Gustavo all the Latin America regional from the project. We made also the engagement with different stakeholders and different actors in order to achieve the goals of this project. So we have been working together for a year and a half in this. So nice to meet you. Anna, I'm conservation coach also.
Thanks, Valentina. So Valentina is looking after the chat for this webinar. If you have throughout the webinar any questions, please just put them in the chat and we will collect them and then go through all of the questions at the end of this webinar. And myself, to introduce myself, my name is Frank Weisenberger. I'm as well coordinating the Community of Practice Indigenous Conservation Standard Projects, and I've been working with Gustavo, Anne, Valentina, and Nick over the last 18 months on this project and on the broader learning network. I'm very glad to have you here. And with that, I would like to give you a quick outline of what we have planned for today. First of all, Gustavo's gonna give us a quick introduction to the project context, what it is that we're trying to investigate in this project abbreviated SILC. Then Nick's gonna talk a little bit about the broader learning network and some of the mechanics behind scaling, and we'll introduce the scaling challenge that Foundation of Success has developed as one of the outputs from this broader project. And then we will have a quick glimpse at the scaling challenge on our example, on our project. And we'll round off this webinar looking at the different outputs that were generated as part of this project and how you can get access to those outputs and to this terrific tool that Foundation of Success has developed. And with that, I would like to hand over to Gustavo.
Thanks, Frank. Well, at this point, it's pretty obvious that there has been a great deal of interest in growing conservation programs to address climate change and other pressing environmental problems at the needed scale. Due to this growing interest and pressing realities of environmental problems that we're seeing around the globe, this trend has further been amplified by the ratification of the Global Biodiversity Framework and a number of its targets, which I will mention in more detail in the next slide. I would assume that everyone attending this webinar knows the important role indigenous peoples and local communities played and continue to play in conserving global biodiversity. Indigenous peoples and local communities manage or have tenure rights to roughly 38 million square kilometers of land and sea globally, and contribute to at least 40% of the global protected areas. Therefore, their collaboration, leadership, and support of these global commitments are critical to ensuring success. So, as mentioned earlier, there are currently global and national initiatives that are working to mitigate threats to our planet. One of these is the CoP Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 3 specifically highlights the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities, defined that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas and of marine and coastal areas, specifically those of particular importance to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are effectively conserved and managed, highlighting then the importance of the indigenous peoples and local communities. The Global Biodiversity Frameworks recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories, and strives for equitable governance with indigenous peoples and local communities. Next one, please. All right, you're there already. So if the world wants to reach the ambitious 30 by 30 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it needs to provide relevant tools to indigenous peoples and local communities to meaningfully engage in and lead conservation initiatives on their territories. Adaptations of the conservation standards like healthy country planning have shown in Australia that they are meaningful tools to empower indigenous communities to participate in the conservation planning process and weave indigenous knowledge together with Western science and traditional practices with modern ways. There's a huge opportunity then to catalyze the 30 by 30 initiative with the indigenous peoples and local communities by providing them with the tools they have been asking for to effectively conserve their traditional territories. Indigenous peoples and local communities hold an intimate knowledge of their land and waters, which is embedded in their culture, their laws, and their knowledge systems. They are best placed to lead this initiative. Next one, please. So the conservation standards are a widely adopted set of principles and practices that bring together common concepts, approaches, and terminology for conservation project design, management, and monitoring. Developed by the Conservation Measures Partnership and regularly updated in collaboration with the broader community, this open source strategic process helps conservation teams achieve lasting impact. Next one, please. So increasing access for indigenous peoples and local communities to adaptations of the conservation standards will contribute to achieving the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework and help address global conservation challenges. This is because a planning tool that is adaptable to be locally relevant for indigenous peoples and local community is easily able to be scaled and foster their leadership in conservation initiatives on traditional lands and waters. And there are some specific reasons for that. Some of the main aspects of the conservation standards are that they are built on significant efforts to be, first of all, accessible, using language that is clear and locally relevant. So the idea is to use language adaptations to be meaningful in a local context, reducing barriers to participation. Also being simple and easy to understand while exploring complex issues, providing a clear connection between what indigenous peoples and local communities want to achieve on the ground actions and on the ground actions, translating into multi-year work and monitoring plans. Also accessible by using tools for each step of the process that works in a community setting. Also, adaptations aim to be inclusive and equitable. The process can be adjusted to adapt to local governance arrangements and decision-making processes, as well as empowering, considering that indigenous knowledge, culture, and values are central. So conservation standards, as well as healthy country planning, provides the structure for weaving traditional knowledge in with Western science. The idea is to develop highly visual outputs that work both in a community setting and with funding agencies strengthening community ownership. And there is solid evidence that confirms that indigenous and locally led conservation results are more effective, leading to long-term biodiversity and social well-being outcomes. So with that, now let's hear from Nick, who will talk about the scaling framework. Nick, please.
Thank you all. Glad to be here and glad to share this scaling framework that we developed. Next slide, please. So our scaling framework is based on initially some research we did on different scaling frameworks developed by many different people. So these are just a few of the many examples of scaling frameworks that were out there that we looked at. These come from both the business and management literature, and then they also come from the systems thinking literature. So there's a lot of ideas that people have had about how to take an initial concept and to scale it up. So we took all those, and our framework really combines three different ideas, three different streams of practice. So the first is all those different frameworks for taking actions to scale. The second is bringing in concepts of behavior change and how to think about behavior change in a systematic fashion. And the third is harnessing the power of networks. And so we took those three different streams of practice and brought them together to create our scaling framework. So from that literature review, we came up initially with 5 different approaches for taking an initial concept to scale. So what you can see in the diagram here is maybe we're working with 2 different groups of people in site A and site B, and we've come up with some idea that we think is working really well, and we would like to take that idea to scale. So the first approach is to take the initial pilot and just make it bigger. So you would expand the initial concept, maybe expand the team doing the work, and you would increase the area from maybe one small test area to the entire watershed or something like that. So we're expanding the initial concept. The second approach is you start with your concept and you replicate it in programs. So you might hire different teams or find different teams that can work with different groups in different places across the landscape or seascape. So in this case, we're replicating in programs. The third approach is to take that initial idea, and rather than replicate it yourself, you put that idea out and make it available to the rest of the world, and you hope that other people will take your idea and replicate it themselves. And so you can see here, this is spreading across the landscape, maybe even across international boundaries or different boundaries that you're working on. So this idea of replication, all 3 of those are forms of what people might call scaling out, or taking the initial concept and just trying to do more of it. But there's also 2 other ways to think about going to scale. So one, which we might call scaling up, is to change the system conditions. So rather than work site by site, we might go to the capital city and try to change a policy or to do a market-based approach or something that's going to change the entire system. And then the 5th approach is to harness the power of networks and to get people to have an initial idea and to start to spread that idea across networks. And it's really changing the norms of the system, changing people's beliefs and understandings so that these ideas spread and move across the landscape. So these are the 5 different ways that we can think about doing scaling work. So for each of these areas, we came up with what we would call a theory of change. For those of you familiar with the conservation standards, this should look fairly familiar. But this is not a specific strategy so much as a scaling approach or a scaling strategy. So this is one of those models that I showed you, the replicate in programs. And it starts with a core strategy is designed or discovered. And so you have that initial pathway that is implemented. And from there, you want to replicate it in programs. So the next step, you can do a bunch of work there, but the next step is to have many projects replicated in program. So the program team decides to employ the key strategy in suitable new locations. They need to get a lot more resources, or they need to find net scale efficiencies. Then they can train additional project teams to come in and implement the work. They successfully implement the core strategy in multiple new locations. And if they do that, the lead actors will adopt the desired practices across all locations in the program. So the yellow things show you here the things you would actually have to do to make that scaling happen. I won't go into them, but there's a lot of detail here. And then across this, we could also look at some key assumptions that are inherent in this work. So you can see this is the overall strategy, but there are some assumptions here. For example, two of the key ones are that you can get more resources to implement that program, and also that you can find efficiencies of scale so that it's not as expensive to do 10 projects on a per project basis as it would be to do one. So these are some of the many different assumptions in our theory of change, and we have similar assumptions for each of those 5 different scaling approaches that I showed you. Next, please. So in addition to looking at scaling approaches, the second stream was looking at behavior change. And there's a group called RARE who was part of our network. And they, a few years ago, came up with 6 different behavioral change levers. These are ways in which you can change people's behavior. We looked at many other approaches. So other social science groups have also thought about ways of thinking about behavior change. And again, we took all these different approaches and used it to create our own list of ways of changing people's behavior. We've shorthanded it, maybe being a little too cute, as sway me, norm me, nudge me, make me, tempt me, show me, and help me. But these are all different ways that you can work to change the behaviors of key individuals that you want them to get, either doing more things that you would like them to do or less things that you think you don't want them to be doing. And then the last stream ties to that idea of network and networking theory. And we were working with a professor who has come up with an idea of how to harness networks and how to understand networks to make behavior change happen, a guy named Damien Santola. And he has a very interesting idea that if you want to make complicated behaviors adopted, it's not what people originally thought it would be, where you have to reach that influencer, the person in the center of the network. What he found is that for complicated behavior change, that person in the center is actually the last person to change, and that where change happens in a network is on the periphery, on the edge. And that's where you have to think about using the network, is to start change on the side and then have it spread from there. And I think if we look at the spread of things like healthy country planning, I think it's a pretty good, interesting illustration of, or even the conservation standards, it's a pretty good illustration of some of these points that Damon's been making. So those are the 3 different parts of our scaling framework: taking actions, promoting behavior change, and harnessing networks. And we had this framework, but we wanted to test and see, does this framework actually make sense in the real world? And so that's where we decided to help build a learning network to assess this framework. So a learning network is an idea that if you want to test an idea, you do it not in an experiment with an artificial setting, but you bring together real-world case study programs. So a generic learning framework might have program A, which is implementing a bunch of projects. And then in our case, we had 6 total different programs. And the idea is to bring them together, have them implement their work, but also think about scaling, and then take the lessons that they're learning and use that through a network coordination team to learn lessons about scaling that we can then share with other organizations, with funders, and other networks around the world. So the learning comes from the programs, it comes across the program network, and it comes hopefully being shared with the rest of the world, which is one of the things that we're trying to do today. So our learning network had 6 different organizations. It was funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation. And the 6 programs, the real world programs, one was looking at climate smart shrimp. So how do we make mangrove friendly shrimp production? One was looking at ways of doing more sustainable farming in US row crop systems in the United States. One was looking at scaling adaptive management within protected areas in Latin America and the rest of the world. One was looking at reducing illegal killing of birds, vultures, and other major birds in the Mediterranean area. One was looking at improving coastal zone management in the Philippines, Indonesia, and then hopefully the rest of the world. And so those were all 5 different case studies of thinking about going to scale. But there was a really important 6th case study that we involved in the network as well, and that was the scaling of indigenous-led conservation using the conservation standards. And that's the case study that we're going to focus on and learn more about their scaling work today. So with that, I think I will turn it back to the others.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that background, Nick. So there is, I guess, a reason why we are part of this wonderful scaling network for the past 18 months. And that is due to what happened over the last 13 years in Australia and the scaling story we have to say over there. And the story started in 2008 to 2010 in the very far northwest of Australia in the Kimberley region, with the first adaptation of the conservation standards that was developed with the Wunamagambra traditional owners in the far northwest of Australia. They wanted to declare an Indigenous protected area, and for that they had to develop a management plan that lays out what they want to do with their traditional territories when they manage it for conservation values. When they developed this first adaptation, neighboring groups that they had cultural tie with picked up on this same approach simultaneously, and the story started. Between 2010 and 2012, there were only 4 healthy country plans that contributed 1.25% to the National Reserve System in Australia. The National Reserve System is a federal system of all the protected area, under which Indigenous protected areas fall as well. And then over the coming years, this figure grew steadily. We did a lot of training. We shared our experiences with other Indigenous land managers in Australia, and you can see more and more healthy country plans popped up. First, the development happened across the north of Australia, where Indigenous land management historically was a lot stronger, and then over the last few years it extended more into the center and into the south of Australia. You can see all those different Indigenous groups that have developed healthy country plans with those colorful polygons. Those ones that you can see easily on that map are those that are really, really large. We're talking about areas the size of some countries, but that doesn't take away from all those more fragmented areas of Indigenous people that are very small spots on this map that you can hardly see without magnifying glasses. But after 13 years of scaling healthy country planning in Australia, now 22.9% of our national reserve system is covered and governed by healthy country plans, and a total area of 1.4 million square kilometers. So it is quite a significant story. And I guess we wanted to use this experience we had in Australia, as Nick was saying, to ground truth and to fact check some of the things that came out of the desktop research that Foundation of Success did. And so breaking it down to the different scaling models, for us in Australia, it all started with the first scaling model, what we frame as diffusion. And that was about, for us, about recording all our learnings from the first adaptation and subsequent adaptations. We created reference cards, we created certain tools that help groups through the process. and we've written peer-reviewed articles to share our experience more in scientific circles. So we recorded a lot of the information as we went along and refined as we went, and that was the foundation for our training material. If you remember, the story started in the northwest of Australia, and it was a collaboration between multiple organizations, the Woonamagambra traditional owners, the Kimberley Land Council, what is the Aboriginal representative body. It's a semi-government organization that represents Indigenous people in that region, and an Australian NGO called Bush Heritage that collaborated with the traditional owners. The Land Council used the same planning approach simultaneously for other groups that they were representing and looking after, and within their own operational area, they expanded and used scaling model 1 to achieve economies of scale. We then were very lucky in Australia that we had 3 years of funding through the Nature Conservancy to start training up a whole heap of conservation standard practitioners and coaches over the years. 3 years of funding meant we were able to train 3 cadres of coaches, and they took what they learned and they took the Healthy Country methodology back into their communities, and some of those eventuated afterwards as new plans that were developed over subsequent years. I mentioned beforehand a lot of the demand for a adaptation in Australia stemmed from a federal funding program from the Australian government called the Indigenous Protected Area Program, that is similar to the Indigenous Conserved Community Areas, or ICAs, internationally used. It's a form of community-driven protected area. Those protected area managers in the popular heydays of the Indigenous Protected Area Program met every 2 years and exchanged ideas. So that was a good conduit to tell the story of healthy country planning. And at that time, we were as well successful of collaborating with the government in including healthy country planning in the guidelines for Australian protected area management plans, what gave them another boost in popularity. And those kind of 4 things together were really core to the scaling effort that happened. So to give you a quick rundown on the structure of our project, as I mentioned beforehand, we used Australia in the bottom right corner as our grounds to look back retrospectively and check how scaling happened. Then our project focused in particular on North America and Latin America as 2 other regions that already have seen early adaptations of the conservation standards. And in those regions, we were supported by a group of other conservationists, community conservationists that were operating in America. We have here on this call both Gustavo and Valentina, who were representing Latin America, Gustavo being based in Brazil, Valentina being at that time based in Colombia. And we had colleagues in Africa. Anne was very much supporting our endeavors. And we had in Asia Natalino and Hamad Kusworo that helped us. And last but not least in Australia, Daniel Oates, he was the Land and Sea Manager of the Aboriginal representative body. And I was co-leading this project together with my colleague Sam Bailey, who was later then replaced by Gustavo when he moved on to new adventures. The project was governed by a steering committee with those friendly faces that I've just shown to make sure that this project is really driven from a community perspective and it's not non-Indigenous people in Australia making big assumptions about Indigenous people and local communities elsewhere in the world. There were 2 program leads, myself and Sam at the beginning, and then Gustavo, who did a lot of the running around and keeping the project ticking over. And as I mentioned, we were focusing in 3 core regions. Our research, we engaged their regional facilitators. In North America, that was Amanda Sheedy. For Latin America, it was Valentina, as you mentioned earlier, and Sam and myself working in Australia. And in those regions, we undertook online surveys to get input from quite a lot of people. We went deep and interviewed a number of key players in Indigenous land management in the regions to get a better understanding and a better in-depth understanding. We held regional workshops, and then we've developed all those things up into 3 regional case studies, which we will mention at the end of the webinar as one of our project outputs. But by focusing on those 3 regions, we by no means want to forget our colleagues in Africa and Asia. We held regional workshops in both regions to ground truth and to check whether the findings that we had in Latin America, North America, and Australia have feed and actually make sense in other geographies, because clearly, as a community of practice, we're trying to support Indigenous people globally and not only in selected regions. And yeah, this project kind of kept us busy for an 80-month period or so, and all culminated in a global synthesis workshop. And with that, I would like to hand back quickly to Nick to give an idea about what this scaling challenge is all about. I'm pretty sure he can tell you a great story.
Thanks, Frank. So if we look at our learning at the network level, what we've taken from the experiences that the Indigenous Peoples Network, as well as the other 5 case studies have done, we came up with 5 major lessons. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but our 5 lessons were that our initial 5 scaling approaches were generally validated, although we made some changes to them. Behavior change theory is essential to our framework. We need to think about what we're calling systems first thinking to find the right combination of scaling approaches. We're still wrestling with how to tap the potential of network analysis, and we can use our framework to take our own framework to scale in conservation and beyond. Next, please. And our lessons are summed up in something we're calling the FOS Scaling Challenge. So it's a set of slides and principles, well, in the slide deck, that you can use to take your own program to scale. So it harnesses the lessons that we've learned. This is still a little bit of a work in progress, but we're going through what we're calling a beta version right now. Next, please. And so the scaling challenge has 3 main steps and a bunch of small sub-steps. So the very first step is to sketch out your proposed scaling strategy. And in particular, we ask you to do 6 things: to describe the core concept and units that you want to take to scale, to depict your primary actors and their desired behaviors, to then define the scope of your scaling ambition, determine what we're going to call the system tilt and potential barriers. So is the system working for you or against you? To decide on your scaling approaches, and then to detail the math, need to check effectiveness and the feasibility to refine your scaling ambition. So that's all a very first initial sketch that probably would take a team a few hours to go through. Based on that, you would then maybe repeat that with additional actors as necessary. And we'll explain more what that looks like in just a second. And then based on that, you would make a formal go, no-go decision about your scaling and then develop a more full scaling strategy. So these are the steps in the scaling challenge. It's a way to quickly decide whether your idea makes sense to scale and what that might look like. And to illustrate how this works, I think Frank and his colleagues will take you through how they would have answered the scaling challenge. And so this is just a workbook that you will have. We'll make this workbook available. And if you want to try it yourself, you can do that. You can do it on your own, or if you need additional coaching, you can also contact us at Foundations of Success for facilitation support. And as you'll see in the workbook, there's blue slides that explain each step. There's an example from the shrimp aquaculture that gives you an example of how to do each step. And then there's a place to try it yourself with the different colored slides. Next, please.
Wonderful.
So I think it's over to you, Frank, to show folks how to take the scaling challenge, how you took it.
Thank you, Nick. And a quick spoiler alert at the beginning. You may look at the tool and think, oh, I know everything. I got that already down packed. Because when we do our work, we all find ourselves often in our little rabbit holes where we think we know the ins and outs. One thing that was very obvious for me when we started this project, that we're often not very clear in communicating a lot of those things. So this tool actually helped us incredibly much communicating some of the things that were all happening in our heads more clearer and more better to the outside world. So as we said early on when we did the introduction to our project, from the 13 years of seeing healthy country planning spread across Australia, we formulated that in our scaling strategy that by creating improved access to relevant adaptations of the conservation standards, we feel confident we can empower Indigenous people and local communities to lead and effectively manage conservation projects on their territories. That is our scaling goal. Our scaling strategy is to improve access, to help people get access to those adaptations. I alerted to that beforehand. The unit for scale in our case are the traditional territories of one Indigenous group. That those may be as big or as small as the traditional territories are. We are very flexible there. And the boundaries of our scaling units are the boundaries of the nation state. While it is very clear that nation states are a construct of recent colonial history, and they are though still the boundaries where policies and legislation change between countries. And for the effort or the success of Indigenous people to scale, those policies are a key enabler. So in a second step of the scaling strategy then, we kind of need to figure out what is actually the desired behavior we want from our actors. Nick was alerting beforehand to the fact that there are primary actors and secondary actors. So to do this, we use a feature that is central to the conservation standards, and that's a series of change or results chains. They are simple diagrams that read from left to right in an if-then causal way. Our scaling strategy is on the right side in the green box, what we want to achieve. And as we already explained beforehand, our primary actors are those Indigenous people and local communities that we want to use those adaptations. For them to use those adaptations, there are two factors in a very simplified way contributing. One is that relevant adaptations for the different regions in the world exist, and then that people, Indigenous people, actually have access, know about them, can access the materials, and can access the technical support. When we thought about it, and when we looked back in Australia, it was very clear there is as well secondary actors and even tertiary actors involved. And those are more the stakeholders, those environmental NGOs that have long-lasting relationships with Indigenous people. Gustavo mentioned beforehand that Indigenous people are looking after some of the most biodiverse areas in the world. So there are long relationships with different funding agencies that support Indigenous people in their endeavor to conserve those values. And there is then as well all those trusts and funds that provide the finances to those NGOs to do their work. So what we want from them is, we want them to support Indigenous people and to see the benefits that come from a transparent way of developing conservation plans. And we want them to share this to share this view of the benefits with other stakeholders to generally create a supportive environment in which all the different agencies supporting Indigenous people help Indigenous people access a good planning framework. From there, when we figured out what we want to achieve, we need to figure out what is our scaling ambition. We knew what was possible by looking back on the last 13 years and what we could achieve in that period. And as Gustavo mentioned beforehand, while this project happened, there was a landmark agreement that was ratified, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and that provides the time boundaries for our medium-term and our long-term ambition. It's needless to say, when you work with local communities and Indigenous people, that their custodianship has been ongoing for millennia, and a short time frame from a global agreement is not really in the right context, but because this agreement allows us to serve a wave of popularity, we use those timeframes underlying. So the long-term ambition is that by 2030 we can provide access to adaptations to IPLCs globally. We do understand that in the short term, on the medium term, in the next few years, that we need to focus on those places where some of those the underlying context is beneficial and where we have seen already some early adaptation. Hence why our medium-term ambition focuses on North and Latin America, hoping we have some seed projects in Asia and Africa, and then in the long term, seeing that spread across the world. To visualize that quickly, we have the dark green points as the scaling that already happened. In the midterm, we would like to see increased access to adaptations to conservation standards in North America and Latin America with some seed projects in Africa, and then seeing that equally distributed across the world. We did, and to get to the topic of system tilt, we did a very simplified system analysis from across the world for those countries where Indigenous people are forming a strong part of the population. And by using two criteria that became clear by looking back at our research in Australia, the first criteria being a national policy context being in place that provides Indigenous people with secure pathways to tenure and that recognizes Indigenous people. And the second criteria being that a national policy context support Indigenous people's conservation initiatives and provides them with some sort of management rights. And we use those two criteria, three rating categories, and we just really did a simple desktop analysis. And we came out with countries where that are most favorable to Indigenous people at conservation, what we would call those with a downward system tilt. We've seen countries with a flattish system tilt, where some of those factors may be present, but others are missing. And last but not least, we experienced that some countries are actually facing an upward system tilt where the circumstances are not necessarily yet great for Indigenous people-led conservation. We didn't use system tilt as a way of determining what countries to only focus on. When we work with Indigenous people, we need to acknowledge that we need to work in all three different systems, but we use system tilt as a way of sequencing our scaling approaches. To do that, another tool that Nick and his team at Foundation of Success developed that is very helpful is the sixth step of this scaling challenge, and this is the decision-making tree we're looking at. It helps us determine what approaches people should be using depending on the system tilt. I'm going to browse through those ones very quickly. The way how you use this decision-making tree is you just highlight or broaden, depending on your system, tilt those arrows, and they will lead you to your scaling approach. As it is with those tools, they are a guidance to help you, but it is guidance that you need to fine-tune to a point to your specific context for your conservation strategy. So we made some small adjustments, but overall this decision-making tree helped us greatly on determining the different scaling approaches. And how that looks like, I want to show you on those next 3 slides. As I said, there are some groups and there are some countries that experience a downward system tilt that is generally positive and supportive for Indigenous-led conservation. There may be a first hump that needs to be overcome before you actually can create this momentum. And that's what we've experienced here in Australia, where the circumstances were great for Indigenous people led conservation, but they were lacking a locally relevant adaptation. Once this adaptation was developed and the different stakeholders supported each other by including the approach in the guidelines for protected areas and by providing support for training, and we could actually overall achieve a very successful scaling experience, and we could scale out using approach 1 and 2 and replicate and expand. But then some countries don't have all those all the perfect context. We would call them countries with a flattish system tilt. There may be not sufficient recognition, or there may be recognition but not great pathways for resourcing the planning initiatives of Indigenous people or for providing them with management rights. So at the beginning, before we can talk about scaling out, we need to probably create some more of those enabling conditions, and what we can do through approach 4 by collaborating with stakeholders and creating some of the policy change, or by approach 5, where it's more around proper advocacy to create and change some of the system norms to make a more enhancing environment. Once those enabling conditions are put in place, a locally relevant adaptation and approach 1 and 2 replication expansion can help us to scale out. And last but not least, those countries where both of the criteria are missing, they're facing an upward system tilt. And in that, the first effort would be focused on pollinating, creating some of, making sure and articulating some of those benefits of Indigenous-led conservation, focusing on advocacy, transforming the norms, collaborating with different stakeholders to create enabling conditions, to pool funding in a more collective impact approach. And after that, we can kind of develop a adaptation and scale out. I think the key message here really is that, and that differs between different people's scaling strategies. You can use system tilt as a way of determining where you want to operate, or you can use system tilt, how we used it, as a way of sequencing the different scaling approaches, because we've experienced that it's not only one scaling approach, but a mix of scaling approaches that we need to employ. And you, with that step, the last step that you have to do is detailing the maths, checking the effectiveness and the feasibility of your ambition. And once you figured that one out, you kind of reached the end of the first iteration of the scaling challenge, what puts you then into a position to make a formal go or no-go decision. So we used those learnings to help us focus at the work that the Community of Practice Indigenous Conservation Standard Projects is undertaking. We want to support the development and distribution of locally relevant adaptation, scaling model around diffusion, so that people can use those adaptations and run with them and apply them in their specific context. We want to and create a network through communication and outreach that improves our practice, to ensure that we share our learnings, and that people actually through this network find access to some of those resources that we develop. Focusing on advocacy and awareness raising about the benefits of the conservation standards and the adaptations for long-lasting conservation outcomes. And last but not least, providing training and support so that Indigenous people in local communities can replicate their adaptation, that is either by accessing training or by just accessing the resources, the materials that we have developed to capture some of that knowledge. So those are some of the key things that we've been doing. I mentioned to you earlier on, as part of this project, we created a whole heap of outputs that responded to some of the needs that people we spoke to, and we discussed things articulated to us. One was to develop a brochure about what the adaptations of the conservation standards are and what they can do. It is about another publication that identifies what the community of practice is doing. And we created a whole heap of case studies from around the world, from Canada, Ecuador, Colombia, Sweden, and Australia, to provide some first-hand examples for people to look at how the conservation standards are applied by Indigenous people. All those materials are translated in 4 languages. So they are, aside from English, in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa, to make them as relevant and accessible for as many people as possible who might want to learn about that. And I mentioned beforehand, from our research, we created as well regional case studies that are fresh from the press. A regional case study detailing the findings for Canada, for Latin America, and for North America. Those documents, the Canadian, the North American, and the Australian report are only available in English, and the report on Latin America is only available in Spanish, as being the first language this research was undertaken. You can access all those resources through our homepage. If you scan this QR code, or you look in the chat, where Gustavo or Valentina would have posted a link, you can find our landing page in the internet. Aside from those resources that I just mentioned, there are articles and publications and different guides that people developed across the planet. There is a map on there that tried to help promote some peer-to-peer exchange between communities who use the conservation standards, so that people can directly contact everyone. And there's equally links to our webinars and a whole heap of other news hidden on our homepage. So have a look, come past, and become part of our network. We are facilitating a listserv to connect all the practitioners in our community of practice. If you want to subscribe to our listserv, just send us an email to the Gmail address that we can see up there. Or you can follow us as well on LinkedIn, where we're posting some of the news when there is exciting new opportunities coming up or new resources being published. Those are 2 ways how you can learn, or those are the pathways how you can learn more about the community of practice. I'm pretty sure that you would be all very interested in learning more about this fantastic tool that Foundation of Success has developed. And for that, I hand over to Nick to tell you guys how you can find out more about the scaling challenge.
I think you can go to the FOS website, fosonline.org, and /scaling, and use the QR code, and that should take you to the deck that Frank mentioned. And also, if you want to contact us, we're happy to provide facilitation support as well.